Although in engineering and engineering technology and physics, typically we mean a vector as a quantity that has a magnitude and direction. In math, it has a little bit different connotation. And mathematically, a vector is a line that connects any 2 points in 3D space. So let's say we're dealing in Cartesian space. I'm going to have a vector. We'll call it, or a point, excuse me. We'll have a point, let's call it M. It has, in Cartesian coordinate system, a x component, which is the distance along the x-axis, a y component, which is the distance along the y-axis, and a z component, which is the distance along the z-axis. So that's a point M, and then if I have another point N, I'm just going to say it's x sub n, y sub n, and z sub n. So in 3D space, that just means I've got a point and a second point. A vector is a line that connects any 2 points in space. And so a vector exists, and I'm just going to give it a name, A, and I'm going to say that it goes from M to N. I note vectors when I'm writing them by putting an arrow over it. And its direction is, the definition of this direction is x sub n minus x sub m times a hat x plus y sub n minus y sub m times a hat y plus z sub n minus z sub m a hat z. So this vector points from M towards N, or said another way, M is the beginning of the vector and N is the end point of the vector. You'll notice that after each of these numbers, which are going to be scalar, that's like 3 minus 5 or 10 minus 1, those are going to be scalar numbers. After each of these scalars numbers, there's a little thing that I called hat, a hat quantity. Well, what is this hat quantity, a hat x, a hat y, and a hat z, and what does it signify about the vector? And if we were to plot the Cartesian plane, there is a very special point on the Cartesian plane, and it's at the very center. It's where the x, y, and z axis all intersect. We call that point the origin, and its location is 0, 0, 0. So it's the axis it's the point of intersection of these 3 mutually orthogonal axes. By drawing a line from the origin to any point that is only 1 unit and only in one direction, we create a unit vector. So I've got a unit vector pointing in, let's say, the y direction. I call that a hat y. If I've got a unit vector pointing, or a vector that points in the x direction from the origin along the x-axis here, I call that a hat y, or a hat x. And then the same for the z-axis, right? That's a hat z. So the point is that these are 1 unit long, and they're pointing purely in the x direction, purely in the y direction, and purely in the z direction. And what these are is these are reference vectors. They tell us, if I wanted a vector that points 2 units in the x direction, it would be 2 a hat x, right? It tells me what direction is. So from this, we see that the unit vector, it's a vector that points in only one direction, and it has a magnitude or a length of 1. And the purpose of the unit vector is really that it contains directional information. If we were to take a scalar number and multiply it by the unit vector, the result's a vector with magnitude equal to that scalar that's pointing in the direction of the unit vector. For example, let's say I define the vector r as equal to 3 a hat x plus 4 a hat y. So what that would tell me is if I've got my x-axis here and my y-axis here and my z-axis here, 3 a hat x tells me that this vector points 3 units in the x direction, 1, 2, 3. And it points 4 units in the y direction, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so the vector 3 a hat x plus 4 a hat y extends from the origin to that point right here. That's vector r, and it's in the xy plane in this case, right? So I just want to take one additional second and make sure to point out how vectors are written on paper. Notice that when I write a vector, I always write it with an arrow above it. In textbook, vectors are often written as bolds. and I can't do that. They usually don't put the arrow above it, so this is how I handwrite vectors. Unit vectors in textbooks are usually bold. I can't do that, so I put the hat above it instead. So just a little note on writing notation.